He thought he was flying to Texas to build a future with a girl he loved. Instead, he walked straight into a nightmare, one that exposed a hidden surgeon, a secret shed in the woods, and a woman who'd been silenced for years. Ethan Ward was a 38-year-old accountant living a quiet, predictable life in Ohio. His days were spent at a cramped office desk, and his nights were filled with silence that settled heavily across his small apartment. Years of routine had made him numb to excitement, and online spaces became the only places where he felt connected to anyone. One evening, while scrolling through a dating app out of habit rather than hope, he matched with a 19-year-old girl named Lila Torres from a remote town in Texas. Her profile showed only a few images, each cropped in ways that revealed almost nothing about her surroundings or body. Still, there was something intriguing about the way she presented herself. Her messages were short but clever, and her timing always matched his loneliness. Ethan began rearranging his evenings so he wouldn't miss a chance to hear from her. Lila didn't share much about her personal life, but the mystery only drew him in further. She always managed to say just enough to keep him wanting more, and Ethan convinced himself that she simply valued privacy. Her age difference felt unusual, yet she never seemed bothered by it, which made Ethan feel unexpectedly desired. Weeks passed, and their conversations became the highlight of his day. Lila hinted at wanting to meet someone who understood her, someone patient and calm. Ethan believed he was exactly what she described. The idea of meeting her began to take shape slowly, turning into a hope he hadn't felt in years. When Lila finally suggested they see each other in person, Ethan felt a surge of excitement he hadn't experienced since his early 20s. Without hesitation, he agreed, convinced their connection was real and worth crossing states for. Ethan booked his flight to Texas the morning after Lila suggested they meet. Acting before doubt had a chance to settle in. The decision felt bold for someone who rarely left his hometown, but he believed it was the first meaningful step he had taken in years. As he packed his small suitcase, he imagined what it would feel like to finally see the girl who had occupied his thoughts for weeks. The anticipation overshadowed every practical concern, pushing him forward with a confidence he didn't fully understand. During the flight, Ethan stared out the window, thinking about how different his life might become. The clouds drifting beneath him felt symbolic, like he was rising above the monotony he had lived in for so long. He replayed every message Lila had sent, searching for clues about who she might truly be. Her face appeared clearly in his mind, always framed tightly in her photos, always smiling softly in a way that seemed both shy and inviting. The more he thought about her, the more certain he felt that meeting her was the right choice. When the plane landed, the humid Texas air hit him immediately, heavy and warm. The small town where Lila lived was quiet, with wide, empty streets and old buildings that looked untouched for decades. Ethan took a cab to the modest motel he had booked, noticing how deserted the town seemed. Despite the unease that flickered briefly in his mind, he pushed the feeling away and focused on the plans he and Lila had made. She had sent him a short message earlier, confirming the meeting place. Ethan checked into his room, unable to sit still for long. Everything felt surreal, as if he had stepped into a different life, one he hoped would finally lead to something meaningful. Ethan arrived at the abandoned thrift store a few minutes before the time Lila had given him, wanting to appear calm even though his heart raced. The building looked forgotten, its paint peeling and its windows clouded with dust. The wide, empty lot surrounding it felt strangely silent, as if the entire area had been untouched for years. Ethan tried to steady his breathing, convincing himself that Lila had chosen the location only because she was nervous about meeting an older man in public. The thought eased him slightly, though the uneasiness lingered beneath the surface. When Lila finally stepped into view from behind the building, Ethan felt a jolt of confusion. She looked nothing like the confident girl from her photos. She was thinner, with a pale complexion that suggested she hadn't been outside much. Her oversized shirt hung loosely on her frame, and for a brief moment Ethan noticed that she had no breasts at all, a detail she had never mentioned. Her shoulders were tense, and her eyes darted nervously around the lot instead of landing on him. Ethan felt a mix of concern and disbelief, struggling to understand why she appeared so different and what she might be hiding. Lila didn't approach him fully. Instead, she lifted her hand slightly, and gestured for him to follow her toward the back of the building. Her movements were quick and uneasy, as though she feared someone might be watching. Ethan hesitated but then stepped forward, driven by curiosity and worry. He sensed that this meeting was not about romance. Something darker was buried beneath her silence. As he followed her deeper behind the thrift store, the distance between his expectations and reality grew wider, creating a tension he could no longer ignore. Lila led Ethan along a narrow dirt path hidden behind the abandoned thrift store, moving with a sense of urgency that made every step feel heavier. The air was still, and only the crunch of dry leaves under their feet broke the silence. Ethan kept a short distance behind her, noticing how her shoulders tightened every time she heard the slightest sound. She paused several times, glancing nervously toward the tree line as if expecting someone to emerge at any moment. The tension in her behavior spread to Ethan, filling him with a growing unease he couldn't shake. When they reached a small clearing concealed by overgrown bushes, Lila stopped abruptly. Her hands trembled, and her breathing turned shallow, as though she had been holding fear inside her for far too long. She lifted one hand and pointed toward an old wooden shed that sat tilted to one side, its roof sagging under years of neglect. Despite the heat, Lila didn't move any closer to it. She remained frozen in place, shifting her weight anxiously from one foot to the other. Ethan stepped closer to her and noticed faint scars along her collarbone and the inside of her arms, thin, jagged lines that suggested medical procedures carried out without proper care. The oversized shirt she wore seemed deliberately chosen to hide more than she wanted to show. Ethan realized the scars were not isolated. The unevenness in the way her clothes hung hinted at deeper injuries. The clearing felt suffocating, the kind of place where secrets were meant to stay buried. Lila kept pointing at the shed, urging him silently to look inside, but her own fear kept her rooted to the ground. Ethan felt the weight of responsibility settle on him. Whatever she wanted him to discover in that shed, it was something she could not face alone. Ethan approached the shed slowly, each step making the air feel heavier. The structure looked older up close, its wooden panels warped and stained by years of neglect. A faint chemical odor seeped from the cracks around the door, growing stronger the nearer he came. The handle felt cold against his palm, and when he pushed the door open, it creaked loudly, breaking the silence of the clearing. Inside, dim light leaked through a single hole in the roof, casting sharp shadows across the cramped space. Ethan's eyes adjusted gradually, revealing objects that made his stomach twist. A metal chair stood in the center, bolted to the floor, with worn leather straps dangling from its sides. The straps were stained, their edges frayed from repeated use. Nearby, a small table held metal trays lined with surgical tools, some rusted and others still sharp. Dried fluids clung stubbornly to their surfaces, creating a dark, uneven texture. A shallow sink, connected to nothing, sat against one wall, filled with cloudy water that emitted a sour smell. Scattered across the floor were gloves, tubing, and discarded medical wrappers, all carelessly tossed aside, as if whoever worked here never expected visitors. Ethan's eyes landed on a half-open cooler in the corner. Inside, plastic packets of blood lay stacked in disorganized piles, along with small containers labeled with markings he didn't recognize. The sight made his pulse hammer against his ribs. The entire shed resembled a crude, hidden operating room, a place designed for procedures that should never happen outside a hospital. Ethan stepped back, shaken by the realization that Lila had likely experienced something terrible within these walls. Every object he saw seemed to confirm her silent desperation. As he exited the shed, the weight of what he had just uncovered settled heavily on his chest, leaving him with a cold, unsteady dread. Ethan stepped out of the shed feeling unsteady, the images from inside still flashing through his mind in sharp, disturbing fragments. Lila stood exactly where he had left her, frozen in place as though she had been holding her breath the entire time. Her eyes searched his face, trying to read his reaction, and the fear in her expression told him she already knew what he had seen. She lifted a shaky hand and grasped the neckline of her oversized shirt, pulling it aside just enough to reveal the upper part of her chest. The skin beneath was marked by uneven, jagged scars, raw evidence of a surgery performed with no proper care or expertise. The stitches had healed poorly, leaving visible ridges and indentations that made Ethan's stomach tighten. She lowered her hand slightly, revealing more of the harsh lines carved across the flat plane where her breasts had once been. The scars varied in length and depth, some faded and others still pink, suggesting multiple procedures done over time. The way she held herself, tense, guarded, and exhausted, told Ethan that these injuries were not voluntary. He noticed smaller marks across her ribs, faint but numerous, hinting at repeated medical interference. The loose clothing she wore seemed chosen to hide the full extent of the damage, but even beneath the fabric he could see the uneven shape of her torso. Lila pointed toward the shed again, then touched her own chest, forming a silent explanation. She had been taken there for the surgeries. She had been manipulated, harmed, and left disfigured. Her eyes conveyed a desperate mixture of shame, fear, and a plea for understanding. Ethan realized she had contacted him not for companionship, but because she believed he could help her escape the person responsible. That truth settled over him with a weight far heavier than anything he had expected when he boarded the plane. As the wind rustled through the trees around them, Ethan understood that the situation was far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. Ethan barely had time to process Lila's silent confession before a sharp rustling came from the dense tree line behind the shed. The sound was too deliberate to be an animal. Lila's body stiffened instantly, her eyes widening with terror that seemed to freeze the air around them. Ethan followed her gaze and saw a figure stepping out from between the trees. The man moved with slow, controlled steps, as if he had been watching them for a long time. Even from a distance, Ethan recognized the posture of someone accustomed to precision and authority. The man was Dr. Marcus Hale, though Ethan did not yet know his name, only that his presence radiated danger. Marcus wore a dark coat that brushed against his knees, and a fitted mask covered most of his face. In one hand, he held a heavy medical bag, the kind used for carrying surgical equipment. The sight of it made Ethan's chest tighten. Lila shifted backward, trembling violently, her feet digging into the dirt as though she wanted to run, but couldn't force her body to move. Ethan sensed that Marcus was the one responsible for the shed, for the scars, and for the fear consuming Lila's life. The man paused when he noticed Ethan standing beside her. His head tilted slightly, as if assessing whether Ethan posed a threat or was simply another victim drawn into his web. The silence grew sharper with every second, thick enough to constrict Ethan's breathing. Marcus shifted his attention toward the shed, scanning the area with a cold, calculated calm. His posture suggested ownership. This was his domain, and any intrusion would not be tolerated. Lila took another trembling step back, her fear unmistakable. Ethan realized that they were no longer discovering the truth. They were standing directly in front of the man who had created it. Lila grabbed Ethan's sleeve with a sudden burst of urgency, her fingers cold and trembling against his skin. Without waiting for him to react, she pulled him toward the thick cluster of trees leading away from the shed. Ethan followed, sensing that hesitation could cost them far more than time. The forest floor was uneven, covered with fallen branches and tangled roots that forced them to move carefully despite their fear. The sounds behind them shifted, first a slow crunch of leaves, then faster, more determined footsteps. Marcus had noticed their attempt to escape. Lila's pace was frantic, her breath sharp and uneven as she pushed through the undergrowth. Ethan could see how weak she was. Every few steps her knees wobbled, and she clung to nearby branches to keep herself upright. It became painfully clear that she had been living in fear for far longer than she had ever hinted at. Her body carried the exhaustion of someone who had tried to run before, only to be dragged back into the nightmare she was now desperate to escape. The forest around them seemed to close in, thick with shadows and the weight of approaching danger. Ethan could hear Marcus moving more quickly, his strides steady and confident, as though he knew the woods well enough to navigate them without hesitation. Lila stumbled over a fallen branch, nearly collapsing, but Ethan caught her arm just in time, urging her forward. She pointed ahead through the trees, where a faint strip of gray hinted at the nearby main road. Branches snapped behind them, louder this time, signaling how close Marcus had gotten. The fear pressing against Ethan's chest grew heavier with each step. He realized they were racing not just toward safety, but against a man who had every reason to stop them. no matter what it took. Ethan and Lila pushed forward through the dense trees until they reached a wide fallen trunk blocking their path. Lila struggled to climb over it, her weakened body shaking from the effort. Ethan helped her across, but before he could follow, the sound of heavy footsteps stopped him cold. Marcus emerged from the shadows of the forest, his dark coat brushing against the branches as he stepped into the small clearing. His mask hid his expression, but his posture radiated cold determination. The metallic tool in his hand glinted faintly, catching what little daylight filtered through the canopy. Ethan felt the instinct to run, yet he forced himself to stand his ground, understanding that any hesitation might give Marcus the chance to reach Lila. The space between them felt suffocating, filled with the silent threat of what Marcus was capable of. Lila, now on the other side of the trunk, pulled herself up and tried to move farther toward the road, but her legs barely carried her. Ethan positioned himself directly in Marcus's path in a desperate attempt to slow him down. Marcus advanced one measured step at a time, analyzing Ethan with the focus of someone who had faced resistance before. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Ethan noticed the faint sound of cars from the nearby road, a reminder that safety was close but not guaranteed. Marcus paused, turning his head slightly toward the direction of the noise. The presence of potential witnesses appeared to break through his confidence. For the first time, uncertainty edged into his movements. After a tense, motionless moment, Marcus stepped back, retreating into the trees without a sound. His dark figure disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, leaving behind an echo of danger that clung to the air. Lila collapsed onto her knees in the dirt, overwhelmed by exhaustion and relief. Ethan climbed over the trunk to reach her, knowing the threat had only temporarily withdrawn, not vanished. Ethan guided Lila out of the woods and toward the main road, supporting her as she struggled to stay on her feet. When they reached the edge of the pavement, he waved down a passing driver, who immediately called the police after seeing Lila's weakened state. Officers arrived within minutes, and Ethan explained everything he had witnessed, from the shed filled with crude medical equipment to the masked man who had chased them through the forest. Lila remained silent at first, shivering despite the warm air, but her eyes showed a mixture of fear and determination as she listened to Ethan recount the events. At the police station, Lila was given water and a blanket while investigators questioned Ethan in detail. For the first time, Lila began to speak. Her voice was faint, but her words carried the weight of everything she had endured. She identified the man in the woods as Dr. Marcus Hale, someone she had trusted when he initially offered financial help and promised a cosmetic procedure. Instead, he had manipulated her, performed illegal surgeries on her, and threatened her whenever she tried to leave. She explained how he had monitored her movements and prevented her from seeking help. Contacting Ethan had been her only act of rebellion, a desperate attempt to involve someone Marcus would not anticipate. Police officers acted quickly, sending units to search the area around the shed. Later that night, they recovered surgical tools, blood samples, forged medical records, and evidence linking Marcus to several missing persons cases. Lila was placed under protective care and scheduled for proper medical treatment. Ethan, though shaken, agreed to serve as a witness and remain in Texas until the investigation progressed. As he sat in the quiet lobby of the station, he realized his trip, once filled with hope for a new beginning, had instead exposed a hidden crime and given someone a chance at escaping a life of fear.